What do we do when life takes an unexpected turn? When a job is lost, when a health crisis strikes, or a relationship falls apart. What about when life takes an upswing? You land a promotion, your first baby is on the way, your cancer screening came back clear. In moments of change, whether good or bad, we're often left asking one question. What's next?
Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Yeah, I can tell. That's a responsive group of people who are tired. You know, time goes on, time changes, all that fun stuff with time. You know, something neat about time is I was looking this morning over open Facebook, and one of the things that popped up was a memory. And it was a memory of Benjamin getting baptized 11 years ago, which also happened to be the day that Owen Sells got baptized. They got baptized together back when we were a multi-site church up in Noonan. So that was kind of a neat thing to look back, and you know, they were good buddies then, and they're good buddies now, except they're a little bit taller now than they were back then. Like, you can see half of Ben's head in the baptistry. If he did it now, it'd be like his knees. You know, guy, he's a tree. But we are so glad you are here on this daylight saving time Sunday. How much of you are enjoying the fact that you got to get up an hour earlier, lose an hour's sleep? How many of you love that? Yeah, they're lying. Okay, so I know how it is, right? But I think the thing about it is, you know, most of us in life sometimes have to get up earlier and it doesn't affect us that much. I think that the reason it affects us so bad is that everybody has to do it, right? It's not just you getting up, you have to get your whole household up. And that can be a little bit more of a task. But, you know, I think when we look at daylight saving times, there's this myth, and I've heard people say this, that, you know, why can't we be like other countries and not have daylight saving time? Why do we in America have to do that? And it's not just the good old US of A that observes daylight savings time. 34% of the world's countries observe daylight saving time. Most of Europe has a daylight saving time. Over half of Canada observes daylight saving time. I think the half that doesn't is like Saskatchewan in West, where it's like no one lives there anyway, so there's no one to keep daylight savings time because it's just the Yukon. Egypt, or Chile, there's a lot of country, Australia, all observe a daylight savings time. And so it's not just us, but when you start looking at it, like why in the world do we even do it? You find out that this isn't anything new. Archaeologists have found back to ancient civilizations that observed some sort of daylight savings time, that observed a time change based on the sun. If you think about it, especially way back then, maybe even before fire, but they didn't have a lot of extra energy to use. And so they were a very aggregate society. And so they used the sun hours to make things happen. And you probably know about this, a little science lesson for those of you who don't, a little earth science lesson type thing, okay? But there's 4 important times of year that happen when it comes to the rotation of the earth around the sun. 2 of those are called equinoxes. That's when you have 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. It's actually not quite 12 hours because the actual day is 11 hours and 56 minutes. And so you actually only have, you know, that's why we have a leap year, because those 4 minutes add up over time, and now you have an extra a day. So just fun stuff for you to know, you know. But so then you have what we call the solstices. And the solstices, you have the winter solstice when there is way more darkness than there is light. And then you have the summer solstice where there's way more light than there is darkness. Now, depending on where you live on the earth, the more north you are, the greater the effect those have, right? Because like in Alaska, in the winter solstice, there's like no daylight whatsoever. Right? But down in around the equator, it really doesn't matter that much because it's just sunny and beautiful all the time, right? So, I mean, so this is what happens here. So daylight savings time from ancient civilizations was a way to maximize the amount of daylight. Let's make sure we do things in the daylight so we can, you know, not have to worry about being able to see. And so this is why ancient civilizations did that. And so daylight savings time, actually the first country to really do something about that was Germany. We followed suit in World War I. It was called let me make sure I called this the right one. It was called the Standard Time Act of 1918. And basically what it was is we were manufacturing, trying to create implements of war to go to war. And there was an energy crisis in America. So what they decided to do was shift the time so they could utilize more daylight so people at home wouldn't have to turn on their lights and conserve energy so energy could go to making instruments of war. And that happened in World War I, and then when World War I ended, we kind of got rid of it, went back to just everybody having the same time. Then when World War II happened again, we implemented it back into our history where we added some daylight saving times, and that was, again, about a 7-month period where we would shift time so we could use more of the daylight to conserve energy so we could have more energy for the manufacturing facilities and things of that nature. And so after World War II, some people liked it, some people didn't. So it was kind of like, hey, if where you live wants to observe daylight saving time, cool. If not, that's cool. And it was kind of a hodgepodge thing until the Standardized Time Act of 1966. And at that point, we set up hey, here's who we are. We're going to do daylight savings time. And it's going to be that way. And so there were some complaints, just like there are today, of I don't even know why we do it. I think it's stupid, blah, blah, blah. And so they decided in 1974, we're going to get rid of daylight saving time. So everybody talking about it now, this ain't nothing new, okay? It happened before. 1974, they got rid of it. Problem, parents were furious because now their kids in the winter are going to school and it's pitch black outside, okay? I know, I lived in Michigan and dude, it gets dark because it's more north, it stays dark. And when you're having to walk to school in pitch black, not safe, not a good thing, all right? And then people complain too of, I hate driving to work and I can't see anything. It was, people were very upset that it was so dark, and it was like, but this is what you wanted, right? We always ask for something, then we get it, and we realize that's not really what we wanted, right? And so like, oh, I hate this, and it happens, you're like, well, actually, it was kind of nice. Now, I remember when I was working at Kia, and I had to get to work like at 5 in the morning to do a report, so I came to work that morning at 5, and it was in the middle of winter, and when I left, it was, so it was dark when I got there at 5 in the morning, but when I left that day at 5 o'clock at night, it was also dark. I never saw daylight that day. That was a very miserable day. Now, can you imagine, because we get rid of daylight savings time, that's your norm. It's dark and dark. And you want to talk about depression, you want to talk about things that bother you? Yeah. And so they put it back. And they said, okay, we're going to do daylight savings time because, hey, people like to see, It's nice to know that your kids can stand at a bus stop and not get hit by a car because they couldn't see them because it was pitch black outside. It's nice to know these things. And so that's why we still have a daylight saving time to this day. Now, you might be thinking, Pete, that's a whole lot of sermon for something that has nothing to do with Nehemiah. And here's the thing about it, though. Now you know something. Right? Now you guys have learned something this morning. And you're going to find out today that Nehemiah also needed to know some things. That there were some important things for Nehemiah to do his job that he needed to know. And the only way you can know something is to have somebody who's really cool tell you those things, okay? That's me telling you stuff this morning, okay? The really cool part, for those of you who missed that, okay? Because I'm really cool. And that's, right, Baylor? There you go. Yeah, see, that's what I like my college kids. They're always there for me when I need it, okay? So we're going to look at what Nehemiah in our series, What Next, what he needed to know next to know what God wanted him to do. So when my daughter Jo was a senior, for her senior trip, we took her to Walt Disney World. And that was her trip. We went down there and spent a lot of time down there. Now, here's the thing about Walt Disney World. You've heard me say it before. I will say it again. Going to Disney is not a vacation. It is a trip, okay? It can be a good trip, but when I think of vacation, like the cruise Angie and I just went on, that's a vacation. We laid around and did nothing all day long. Relaxation. When we go to the beach, we lay around and do nothing all day long. That's relaxation. That's a vacation. When you go to Disney, you're not laying around doing nothing all day long. You are walking as fast as you can around all kinds of people who don't speak English, who take pictures like crazy, stop in the middle of the walkway to take a picture of like a rock, because apparently they don't have rocks in their country. But they're doing all this stuff, right? And you're trying to get to your ride, so you have to wait in a line for 45 hours. But, when you get back, you're like, that was awful. And then 2 weeks later, you're like, we had so much fun at Disney, and then so you go again. But yeah, it's a trip, okay? It can be a good trip, but it's a trip. And so we wanted to make this trip more enjoyable. We've been to Disney before, and we're like, how do we make this trip more enjoyable? So Angie found this food blogger. And because we were interested in food, that's why Angie and I were going, was for the food, and the kids were going because there's rides and stuff apparently. And so she found this food blogger and started researching where are the good restaurants to go to. Because anything about Disney, a lot of them have their main dining hall, but they also have a quick service side. And you get the same food at the quick service for a little bit cheaper and a whole lot faster. And so we were researching how to go do this, but turns out this food blogger actually worked for Disney. He used to do it freelance, but they hired him. And so he goes at least once a month, if not twice a month, to Disney. And he's there all the time. And so one, he knows a lot about the food, but two, he also started commenting hey, when you go to Animal Kingdom, here's what happens. Everybody takes a left and goes to Pandora first thing because that's the new thing. Everybody loves Pandora. He goes, yeah, don't do that. He goes, go to the very back corner where the safari is. By the way, the safari, that's when they feed the animals in the morning. So if you go in the morning, the animals are a little bit more active. They're walking around because they've just gotten fed. They're happy. And go do the safari first. It's out of the way. Safari walk to the back, but you do that first. And then you would think, now we go in the circle because everybody does a loop. That's standard procedure. He goes, no, you don't do a loop. After you do there, then go over here, and then go over here, and then go over here, and all this stuff, right? And it's you seem like a lot of extra walking, but guess what? He was right. Every time we got to one of those rides, it was a 10-minute wait in the line. Yeah, we had to walk to get there, but we weren't waiting for 2 hours because everybody else was in that cycle of the loop. So when do you hit Pandora? At night, which is, by the way, is way cooler at night because it glows. And so we started listening to this blogger. When we went to Magic Kingdom, same thing. We went to what's it now? Hollywood Studios. I still want to call it MGM because I'm old. Okay, but when you go to Hollywood Studios, there's a new Disney train thing that used to be the movie ride. We went straight there. We got to ride it twice before the park even opened, but we listened to the blogger, right? And so we had made plans to say, hey, here's what we're going to do based on somebody else's research and based on knowledge. We planned this thing out. Now, here's the thing about plans. They don't always work out, right? I get that. Plans don't always work out. But sometimes they do. And some of you in here are planners, right? Some of you already have the next 8 years of your life planned out. You know where you're going on vacation. You know everything that you're doing. Some of you in here have no clue what's happening tomorrow, all right? And that's okay too. Some of you just kind of live by the seat of your pants. But I think most of us like to have some sort of plan. We'd like to have an idea of what's coming up. And yes, plans can have issues. Plans can fall apart. But let me tell you something. When they fall apart, because you have a plan and because you did the research to know, it's a whole lot easier to make adjustments, right? It's so when we were walking from, let's say, one ride to another ride and we realized, oh, this line is unusually long, unlike the guy said, we would just skip and go to the next thing he said. And then we could come back to the other one, right? Because we had a plan, we had knowledge, we knew what to do. If we hadn't planned it out, we'd just been I guess we're just going to stand here for a long time. But because we had a plan, we could adjust to that plan. And that's because we had a lot of knowledge about what was happening, where it was happening. And I think today, as we dig down into Nehemiah, we're going to find out that God had a plan for him. And, and it was about him getting to know things. One of my favorite cartoons in the afternoon when I would come home from school was G.I. Joe. Okay, there was this G.I. Joe cartoon, and it always ended the exact same way. Every episode, they would finish the show, and then they'd go to commercial break, and they'd cut back from commercial break, and there'd be a G.I. Joe character there with some random kid in America today, right? And that kid was about to do something stupid. All right? And so the Joe character would always have a PSA, which is a public service announcement, of how kids could stay safe and what they could do. And so they would show them something, and the kids would be like, oh. And it always ended with that G.I. Joe character. Every single episode, these were the last words that you heard every single time. He goes, now you know, and knowing is half the battle. That's how every episode ended. And so today, we're going to find out that when we can know something, then that's half the battle. That's half that what we need to know to accomplish. Why is knowing only half the battle? Because at some point you have to do something. That's the other half, okay? And so we're going to find out that Nehemiah understands both of these sides of it. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 2 today. If you recall last week, just kind of bring you back up to speed. Last week, Nehemiah was at the king's palace. He's cupbearer to the king. He hears news that Jerusalem is in ruins. It breaks his heart. He cries for days and days and days. He's upset about it. He's like, oh no, what are we going to do about this? And they come up with this plan that he goes to the king and was like, hey, I'm going to rebuild my city walls. And the king's like, okay, what do you need from me? And he's like, well, I need letters for safety, and I need you to provide all the supplies. And the king's like, cool. Okay, and then on top of that, you know what the king did? He was like, hey, let me send you some soldiers too, just to escort you and have fun. So Nehemiah is about to go off on this trip from Susa to Jerusalem, and he's got this massive entourage. He's got letters from the king. He's got servants of the king that are helping with supplies. He's got soldiers with him. He's got his people that are going with him. There's this huge group, and they're heading down to Jerusalem. All right, so let's pick up in chapter 2 to see what happens next. Verse 9 is where we'll be starting. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So as they're approaching Jerusalem, Nehemiah asks for letters to say, hey, what I'm doing is legit. No one's going to fuss at me, right? So he goes and he presents these letters to the governors. And the governors are not happy about what's going on here. He's saying, I got permission to do what I'm going to do, and that makes them mad. So why were they not happy about this? Well, we've talked about this before if you've been here. If not, let me catch you up. So when the Assyrians took over Jerusalem, the Assyrians had a strategy to deal with captives, okay, which was very different than the Romans. If you know anything about the Romans, when they took people captive, they just let everybody stay where they were and just kind of like occupied the area with soldiers. And like, you keep on doing what you're doing. Life hasn't changed except we're here now. You got to pay some extra taxes. That's how the Romans. Assyrians weren't that way. Assyrians were not trusting people. So the Assyrians, when they took you over, they would take your people captive. They would take your young nobles, the educated, back to their capital cities to use them and their intelligence to benefit the kingdom. But then they would scatter everybody else. In other words, they would take you from your home, take you from your farm, take you from your job, and then move you to some other country they'd conquered. And then they would take people from those other countries they had conquered, and they would bring them to your house and put them there and say, now you work this land. Now here's the thing about that. Why would you do that? Well, they're bringing people from all over their captivity areas, different languages, different nationalities, different religions. And so they would all huddle together, not really able to communicate with each other and just told to work. So the Assyrians did this because now there's not going to be this, like if you left all the Israelites together, they could have a revolt. They could come together and say, hey, let's overthrow the Assyrians. Let's have an uprising. Well, now they're scattered everywhere, and the only people left are people who really don't like each other because they were enemies. Now they live be neighbors. And so the only fighting that the Assyrians had to deal with is fighting amongst people amongst themselves. They weren't trying to unify to overthrow the Assyrians. They were too busy fighting about stupid things. When we read about these two governors, they were from nations who Israel once beat up. As a matter of fact, Sam, the first guy, when David took over all of the promised land, his nation was expelled. Israel conquered their nation and pushed them out of the area. So now he gets to kind of come home, and he gets to kind of like, hey, you beat us, but now we're over you. And so this was these governors. They hated the Jews. They hated the Israelites. They hated them. They were their enemies, and they're now the governors of Jerusalem. And that's why Nehemiah was smart to say, I need letters saying that I can build this because they're going to push back. And that's exactly what is going to see happen here, okay? Picking back up in verse 11. So I went to Jerusalem, was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, and I and a few with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring, to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates had been destroyed by fire. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were there to do the work. Now, Nehemiah arrives with this entourage into Jerusalem. Massive group of people, flying the king's colors, soldiers, all of this. And the people who live in Jerusalem are like, why are these people here? And Nehemiah doesn't tell them at all. They just show up and kind of like camp out. Right? It kind of reminds me of that scene in The Grinch when he's like, solve world hunger, tell no one. Right? That's Nehemiah. He comes up to like do something, but he's like, I'm not telling nobody what I'm doing. I'm just here. And so I'm sure that people are like, why is this big group of people here? What is going on? They had no clue, right? But Nehemiah, we see, sneaks out one night, just a few people, just him and like a horse or whatever he's riding, and they go out to inspect the ruins. He goes around and begins to travel and see how bad exactly the situation is. It's so bad in one place that his mount, I'm going to say it's a horse, can't even get through there. And horses are pretty sure-footed, so he has to dismount and walk it because it's so devastated. And so he's doing this inspection. He's walking and seeing exactly what he's about to get into, okay? And so he realizes that things are not looking good. And after 3 days of being there in total secrecy, he decides that he's going to talk to the people now. Picking up in verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will rise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah, after 3 days of investigating and doing research, goes to talk to the people. He goes, hey, here's why I'm here. I'm here to rebuild this wall. All right? And they're kind of like, okay, like, it's not going to be a problem. And he's like, oh, no, it's not a problem. First of all, God told me to. Second of all, the king gave his grace. I have letters from the king saying that we can do this. As a matter of fact, the king's going to pay for the whole thing, right? So this is going to be great. And so they're like, oh, okay, let's rebuild this, right? But the whole time this is going on, we got these governors who are poking fun at them. You guys are failures, not going to be able to do this. You're no good. And they're like, and by the way, you're rebelling against the king. Does the king know you're doing this? And Nehemiah's like, dude, I just showed you a letter 3 days ago saying the king knows I'm doing this. Shut up, right? And he's like, by the way, you have no portion, you have no claim on Jerusalem. It's not your country. So we're doing what God told us to do because this is our country. And so Nehemiah is kind of like, step back. So understanding what happens here at the end of chapter 2, right, what we just talked about, how does that apply to us today? How does Nehemiah arriving in Jerusalem, inspecting the walls, telling the people to rebuild the walls, how does that make any difference in your life and my life today? So there's this old adage that many of you may have heard before. It says, for fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Right? Many of you have heard that. Now, some of you are like opening your Bible right now, trying to figure out where in the Bible you find that. You can look all day and all the next day and the day after that. It's not in the Bible. Okay? That's not in the Bible. Now, some people think it is, but it's not because it says angels. It's got to be in the Bible. No, it's not, okay? Just like the movie Angel in the Outfield, not in the Bible, okay? Just because there's an angel mentioned doesn't mean it's in the Bible. But it's definitely inspired by biblical truths. So a guy in the 18th century, a poet by the name of Alexander Pope, wrote that statement, for fools rush in where angels tread. So see if this sounds familiar to you, okay? Just see if what's happening here sounds familiar. The masses are given access to information that they didn't have before. Now the masses think they're experts on the situation of the information they didn't have before, and they all begin speaking and making criticisms of the information that they now have access to as they're experts, but they're not because they're just the masses and only know what they've understood. So now they get to writing and publishing and putting out there, for everybody to see their intelligence on this topic, right? No, they didn't have social media back in the 18th century. But what had happened was that literacy had taken a spring. The printing press was invented. They had begun to print material in the vernacular, so common everyday people could begin to read literary works of art as well as scripture. And so what's happening is you have these group of people who have really never read that much before, now reading what poets and all these things have written, and they begin to criticize the work. Like everybody here, when they go to a movie, is a movie critic, right? We all have an opinion, but it doesn't mean we know what we're talking about. We just have our opinion. And so what was happening is that the masses were attacking the artists. They were saying, hey, and they were looking at society and what they were going through in society and saying how disconnected they were. Kind of like how disconnected our government is sometimes from what we go through on a daily basis. And they're attacking it. And so Alexander Pope, as an artist, is like, listen, you guys are attacking us. You have no clue what you're talking about. And listen, that is not new, okay? It's not just today with social media that people have been saying stupid things on topics they have no idea about. It's been happening forever. That's why Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Yes, it's a different way we do it. Instead of us actually writing on paper with like handwriting, and they probably wrote in cursive, which no one writes in cursive anymore apparently, but they used to do it that way. Now they just type it on a keyboard. but everybody's a critic. And everybody's got something to say about every topic, even if they have no clue what they're talking about. And it seems like, if we're going to be honest, the people who know the least talk the most. And this is what's happening in that time. This is what happened in Pope's time when he wrote that. So we have this situation where it's happening. Now, Nehemiah knew something about that. And he did something that I think we all can learn from. When we go to fulfill God's purpose for our lives, it's not just about what we do, but how we do it. You see, it's important that we do what God told us to do, but it's also very important how we do that. Because people are watching you. People see you. So let's take a look this morning at 2 ways we can kind of learn this better and put this into practice when it comes to God's purpose for our lives. The first is this: carefully and quietly gather the facts. When God has called you to do something, before you head out to go do that thing you're supposed to do, carefully and quietly gather the facts. In other words, you shouldn't talk about something until you know what you're talking about. Proverbs 17:28, one of my favorite Bible verses, says this: even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. And all of us know the second part that goes with that. When you open it, you just prove how stupid you really are, right? And so we are considered wise when we're quiet. So when you're trying to learn something, stay quiet. Don't talk to people about it, right? We need to take some time to learn about what God wants us to do before trying to do what God wants us to do. Now, I want to pause right here, because what I just said was we need to spend some time learning and studying what we're supposed to do before we go do it. And some of you were here last week and you're like, interesting, because last week I told you some of you need to stop talking and praying about what God's called you to do and just go do it. And now this week I'm saying you need to research and study what you're going to do before you go do it. So you're like, we got you in a contradiction. Boom, right? And I'm like, nah, okay? You didn't, because there are different things I'm talking about, okay? Last week was this. Last week, we used talking and praying to stall doing what God called us to do. I know God called me to go talk to that person at work, but I'm going to keep on praying about it. Even though I know he called me to do it, I'm going to keep on praying about it because I don't want to do it. Peter Marshall once said, the problem isn't that we don't know what to do. The problem is that we know exactly what we need to do, and we just don't want to do it. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in. But what Nehemiah has done is actually the second part of that. Nehemiah is no longer talking and praying about whether or not he should go build the wall. Guess what, y'all? He's on his way to build the wall. He's already made the decision to do what God told him to do. Now he's gathering information to do it correctly. You see, when we went to Disney, we didn't decide where to go in Animal Kingdom until after we booked the trip, right? I'm not going home this afternoon and planning what I need to go to Mars, because I'm not going. Why would I spend all this time planning to pack things for a trip I'm not taking? Once I decide to take the trip, now I'll start planning how I'm going to do it. God said, go build the wall. Nehemiah said, yes. Now he's on this journey to get there. Now he gets there. He's going to walk around and figure out what exactly is this going to require of me? What do I have to do to accomplish this? In other words, how can I be successful? I got to know what I'm up against. This is actually part of doing the thing God called you to do. So they're not the same thing. One of them is stalling to prevent you from doing what God called you to do. The other is preparation to do God glory when you do it. Remember what I said earlier? It's not just about doing what you're supposed to do, it's about how you do it. Listen, when you do a job well, when you fulfill God's purpose in your life and you do that well, who gets glory? God. When you do something God called you to do and you do a terrible job at it, who does everybody look at as a failure? God. Everything you do is a witness to other people about who God is. And so when we do things poorly, it reflects poorly on God. But when we do things greatly, it reflects greatly on God. So if I'm going to do something God's called me to do, how do I want to do it? To the best of my ability, which means I need to know it. I need to spend time learning it. So I'm going to spend that time to say, hey, what do I need to make this happen? And listen, there's reasons for this when it comes to rebuilding the city walls. Because when Nehemiah gets there, it's a difficult task. Well, listen, I don't think you all understand how difficult a task it was, all right? When you hear a wall, most of us think about a cinder block wall, usually about 8 feet tall. It's like 1 block thick. Boom, there's a wall, right? Yeah, that's not this wall. All right, the last we hear of the wall of Jerusalem is when Hezekiah had reinforced it 200 years before the Assyrians came. Here's how big Hezekiah made the wall. First of all, it's 2.5 miles long. all right? 2.5 miles long. That's almost a 5K. So it's a big wall. Now, let me tell you how tall it was. It's 25 feet high. This room is 30 feet high. So it's 5 feet shorter. It's 25 feet high. And it is 22 feet wide. Two-lane road, without a turn lane, a two-lane road is 12 feet in each lane. It's basically a two-lane road on top. People lived in the wall. The wall was so thick, they had houses in the wall. But why was the wall so thick? You know what was right on top of the wall? Chariots. It was a defensive posture. If the enemy's coming over here, instead of running 2.5 miles to get there, you hopped on a horse and chariot and you rode there. When you needed supplies, they brought it to you by horse and cart. It was a means to get defensive places where they needed to be. Look at, this is a massive, massive wall. Just so you know, the Great Wall of China is like 1,300 miles long, so it's a whole lot longer than the wall in Jerusalem. But it's not as thick and not as tall as this wall. This is a massive wall, that's been torn down, and this is what Nehemiah is going to rebuild. And by the way, we're not going to talk about this in great detail. I'm just going to mention it to you. When Nehemiah rebuilds the wall, they only build it halfway. It's only 11 feet tall because it's too big of a task to build that entire wall back. But this is what's before them. It's a big job. The other reason that Nehemiah wanted to know what he was getting into before he got into it was 14 years earlier, a guy by the name of Ezra comes to the king and says, I want to rebuild the temple. And the king says, go rebuild the temple. So Ezra rebuilds the temple. Ezra also attempts to start rebuilding the wall to protect the temple. But these same guys we read about here cry out to the king and says they're trying to have an uprising, and the king stops it. But no, we're not doing this. You're done. And so they've already suffered defeat when it comes to building this wall. They've already had setbacks, and the people are discouraged. You know how it is when you're in a situation, you're trying to do something, you're told to stop, and there's just kind of ruins around you? That's how they've lived for the last 12 years, is in ruins. So the people aren't really doing that great. So Nehemiah understands, if I'm going to do this well, I'm going to have to know some things. I want to spend some time getting to know what I'm getting into, know the people, get a feel for the environment, right? In other words, Nehemiah decided to be wise about that. And Ephesians 5:15 tells us, look carefully that how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. Know what you're supposed to know before you get into it. This is how we need to approach God's plan for our lives, thoughtfully. Okay, God, you're telling me to do this. What do I need to know? What do I need to research? What do I need to study? It's about giving God glory because we've done a good job. The second thing that I think we can apply that we see here from Nehemiah is this. Don't be afraid to attempt great things. Don't be afraid to attempt great things. Being afraid does not mean we don't take risks. It means that we take calculated risks, not careless risks. Chuck Swindoll once said, we are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. You see, Nehemiah didn't ignore the problems facing him. He didn't look at the wall and be like, yeah, no big deal. We'll just try it and see what happens. You know, he studied it. And then when he went to talk to the people, he was extremely honest with his people about what they were getting into. In verse 17, that first part said, then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Nehemiah didn't try to paint some picture that wasn't there. He was like, this is a scary task. This is a very hard task, but we can accomplish it. Listen, if Nehemiah would have, minimalized this problem, they would have failed miserably. You can't overlook the obvious good or bad, right? You can't ignore what's out there. Like during the COVID years, we had started trying to plan a mission trip before that, and then COVID happened. Guess what? We couldn't go on the mission trip. Why? Because we didn't want to? No. Because there was lack of funding? No. Because the other countries wouldn't let people into their country? Yes. So no matter how, we could have been sitting at the airport, bags packed, all the supplies ready to go. But the obvious thing is you can't travel right now. So we look kind of foolish if we're sitting at the airport ready to go to a mission trip and you can't even get to the other country. Nehemiah was well aware of that. He was like, so there's things that are obvious in your life, you can't overlook that. You got to say, hey, here's the situation we find ourselves in, but here's what we can do. Here's what we can do to overcome that. Listen, if God has given you something to do, and it seems impossible. Like there's no way I can get this done. There's a really good chance that is exactly what God wants you to do. God doesn't give you tasks that don't require you to use him to get those tasks done. God only gives us things that we can't do on our own. Why? So we lean on him. So we rely on his strength. Paul David Tripp once said, remember, it is not your weakness that will get all the ways of God's working through you, but your delusions of strength. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. Point to his strength by being willing to admit your weaknesses. Yeah, this job's too hard for me. Great, that means I need God. And if I'm gonna do God's plan for my life, no better way than having God in that plan in my life. And so when you walk with God, you walk through the things you can't do on your own, and his strength is able to move us through that. You have to learn to focus on God, and when we do, we don't have to be afraid. You see, doing those two things successfully helps us accomplish God's plans and purposes for our lives. But there's one last thing we need to consider when it comes to all this, and that's our motivation behind. That's the why behind the what, right? Why I'm gonna do this. And there's two types of motivators in life. There is external motivation and there is internal motivation. External motivation you're all very familiar with, right? That's raises, bonuses, tips, extra credit in school, right? External motivation is if you do this, I will give you this, right? So we're doing something for something else. That's external motivation. External motivation can be a good motivator, right? But it can also be one that works half the time because there's a value cost assessment that happens there, right? Like I talk about, there's smart people and there's not smart people. I worked with a guy land surveying. We told him if he stuck his hand in a fire ant bed for 1 minute, we give him $5. For him, $5 was worth 1 minute of his hand in a fire ant bed, so he did it, all right? I would classify him in the few rocks shy of a full load people category, okay? Because for me, if you looked at me and said, hey, I'll give you $5 if you stick your hand in a fire ant pile for a minute, I would be like, you can keep your $5, right? But if you came to me and said, I'll give you $1 million if you stick your hand there for a minute, I might have to think about that one. See, it's a value thing with external motivators, right? Like, we'll give you extra credit for your class if you write a 75-page essay on this. I really don't need those 3 points, right? But if it's, hey, I'll give you extra credit on your class if you go watch this YouTube video. What was that called again? Yeah, I got it, right? And so motivators, external motivators are only good as the value we assign, what's it worth, right? So Nehemiah could come to them and say, hey, let's rebuild this wall and I'll give all of you a cookie. And they could be like, we're good. I like living in dirt, right? But you could say, I'll give you $1 million, maybe we'll build the wall. But then there's internal motivators. And an internal motivation has to do with your heart. An internal motivation is, I'm gonna do this because I wanna become a better person. And when we do that, there's very few things we come across that can deride us when we're focused in our hearts. When you're determined, maybe just stubborn, you can't be moved. And that's an internal motivation. I don't care how much you offer me, I'm not sticking my hand in a fire ant pile. See, you have an internal motivation that's greater than all of that. Because what you value as a person is greater than anything anybody could offer you. And so Nehemiah says, hey, this is what God has done. This is how God has changed the king's heart. And listen, we don't have to be afraid anymore. I know this is a huge task, but God is with us. See, he internally motivates them and says, this is for you. This is for your nation. This is for your children. This is something you get to set up. And they'll look back and say, my dad built that wall. My granddad built that wall. When you go to Jerusalem today, you know what's standing there? A wall. You know who built it? Nehemiah and his people. That's the motivator. That's something that moves you. Hey, I don't care what comes my way. We'll see later in the next 2 weeks. No matter what came their way, they built that wall. Why? Because that internal motivation was so great in them, nothing could stop them. And when God moves you doing God's purpose in your life, that's how he motivates you. God talks directly to your heart. He stirs in your heart something that, hey, no one can stop you from doing it. Story after story after story of people who are CEOs at major corporations making millions and millions of dollars, give up everything to go follow God's call for their life. Why? Because of external motivation? No, they gave all that up. Because what God was doing in their life was greater than anything the world could ever offer them. Because greater is he who is in me than he that is in the world. Because anything God says is good and perfect. And I can follow after him and know he'll never leave me or forsake me, that he's always with me, and that he helps me accomplish those tasks I need to accomplish. Nehemiah understood that. And we need to understand that in our lives today. That we have a choice when God gives us something to do. We can follow him or we can refuse him. We can chase after what he's given us or we can run away from it. Jesus, when he called his disciples, what did he say? Tell you what, here's the plan. You come with me for 3 years and I'll give you a house on a hill. I'll give you servants. I'll give you all this money, right? Now what did Jesus do? He walked with me, simply said 2 words, follow me. Peter, fisherman, owns a company, owns boats, has a wife, kids at home. What does he do? Drops everything and follows Jesus. All those external motivators couldn't change what God did to his heart in that instant when Jesus said, follow me. That is motivation. And listen, Peter's wife also followed Jesus. In the Bible you read there were women who cooked for them. Peter's wife was one of those women. Because Peter followed Jesus, the rest of his family followed Jesus. Men, when you follow Jesus, your family will follow Jesus too. It's a motivator. This is a legacy I'm gonna leave. It's not gonna be how much wealth I left my kids. It's not gonna be how much inheritance I left my kids. It's gonna be I left my kids, this is Jesus. This is life everlasting. This is the best I can do. So today we have that same question we have to answer. Will we follow God or will we walk away from him? It's not about building a wall this morning. It's about building a relationship with Christ. One that will carry you through the rest of your life. Many of you in this room today have followed him. Some of you have not yet made that choice. Listen, just because you do church things doesn't mean you have a relationship. I can go out this afternoon. There's a basketball goal back here we use for the students. I can wheel that outside and start shooting baskets. You know what? I have no clue who Michael Jordan is personally. I can shoot baskets all day. I highly doubt Michael Jordan's gonna pull up in the SouthCrest parking lot and be like, oh, Pete Sugar's playing basketball, great. Just because I do something and I act like somebody else doesn't mean I have a relationship with them. I could go and grab my golf clubs, head out to the first tee this afternoon, start hitting golf balls. Tiger Woods is not gonna pop up and be like, Pete Sugar, how you doing? It's good to see you. And you come to church your whole life. Doesn't mean that Jesus knows who you are. It's an introduction that has to be made. You have to extend that. You have to say, Christ, I want to know you. I want you in my life. And today, some of you need to stop playing and actually start doing and make that commitment to follow Christ today.